Did you know the idea of public sector disinvestment was first proposed by Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha in his 1991 interim budget? And did you know that this was then taken up by the incoming Narasimha Rao government and rolled out in full gusto? Did you know that this year's budget omitted any reference to public sector disinvestment? This is the first time in 30 years that this has happened. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host, Anil Padmanabhan. This year's interim budget had one glaring gap. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman omitted any reference to public sector disinvestment. As I explained in the introduction, for the first time since 1991 that any finance minister has not leaned on public sector disinvestment to fund its fiscal deficit or a country's gross borrowings. And this at a time when the stock markets are celebrating public sector stock. In the last 1 year, the BSE PSU index rose by a staggering 94%, while the Sensex rose by only 18%. What do we make of all of this? Is this a paradigm shift, or is this the government revisiting the entire public investment strategy? To answer all this and more, we spoke to Tuhin Kanta Pandey. He's a secretary in the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, or what is popularly known as DIPAM. I began by asking Mr. Pandey as to why the PSU stocks have been on fire for the last 1 year.
One of the, for the reasons, I think, first, of course, is the Indian economy itself that, within the context is the growth prospects and others. And we did have issues of COVID, but then management of COVID and the V-shaped recovery and, of course, emphasis on several other things from the part of the government in the form of Atmanirbhar package. Significantly for CPSC on CapEx. Now, growth has been an important factor. Corporate governance is another in the CPSC. Third factor is, emphasis on are aligning their incentive system more in tune with market, both in performance evaluation system, introduction of, for example, new indicators such as, return on capital employed, return on equity, asset turnover ratio, the important considerations which are for the shareholders, communication of that performance. And we have also brought in new listings, some dilution. And the fifth factor in this is the calibrated disinvestment strategy. In fact, what we have been articulating as a new paradigm. In fact, it is something which has been, practiced by us through various initiatives and actually brought to sort of a package, more like in paradigm where we are looking at everything. We had a consistent dividend policy in this as a capital management strategy where every CPSC was asked to at least share 30% of PAT or 5% of net worth, whichever is higher, as a minimum, and more like consistency without sacrificing growth. So it's not that, we were interested in maximizing dividend, but it was a consistently something is to be given. Profitability is to be stressed, but at the same time, use that resources, your own retained earnings and debt to take up new projects, execute them, go to a higher bottom line, higher top line. So I would say all of these measures have been responsible for actually market perception change, because performance has been fundamental, but looking at that performance and believing that performance, and in fact, I think markets have really supported our disinvestment strategy. So to some extent, we have taken a contrarian view, because one line view, which was of which we have been the prisoners last 15-20 years, we think that fiscal deficit will be sort of handled by one item, residual item in the budget, called disinvestment.
Okay, Mr. Pandey, then is it a fact that the disinvestment as an input is ceased to be a fisc tool to manage the fisc?
Yes, I mean, not as a very important, very significant item. Every item matters. In an account, every single item will also come in and chip in. But to, make your fiscal management strategy completely reliant on disinvestment strategy, which could be potentially more volatile. See, on two counts. One, the equity that you are having now, which you can dilute in the market, essentially is come down. Because if you have done about 4.2 lakh crore from 2014 alone, I'm not even counting what was done prior to that. Even post 2014, about 4.2 lakh crores of disinvestment receipts have been received. So, of which significant amount, the strategic disinvestment is about 70,000 crore, which is substantially because of, like ONGC buying HPCL, REC buying, PEC buying REC. Strategic, chunk, management control passed on, but effectively, from the point of view of, I would say, reforms, it's actually the same thing, one public sector to another. But minus that also, there has been a very substantial chunk of equity which has been passed on through market dilution. Now, in many, many companies, it has already reached the limit of 51%, 52%, somewhere around that. So practically, you can't go further down unless you take a decision to fully privatize, which in any case has to be done as per a new policy, and which is time taking, which you have to decide also bare minimum has to be maintained as well, to be retained as per the policy. So that is one factor where, our expectations should also be tempered with, we can't have very tall targets all the time. The second thing is, many a time when you are a value creating phase, your dilution should be calibrated, moderated, sometimes, to wait for value to accrue. So it's not really, it should not be like, it cannot be like a revenue stream where taxes have to be paid irrespective. There is a law with every purchase, GST will come, every sale. So it's not like that. It is a voluntary management. So you have to, and it has to sectorally, you have to manage company. Oil companies, for example, if you have a certain, shock, external shock, a geopolitical event, now your management of that takes far more priority than, doing anything on disinvestment at that point of time. So major privatization transaction will be dependent on whether you conclude it. The process will not fetch you resources. If you conclude it, you get money. If you don't, then entire thing you would be waiting, but actually it will be. So it's like binary. Either you get it or you don't. It's not prorated. So anything of that sort will mean that, 14 months ahead, you plan a target and then you cannot conclude that transaction. Maybe you conclude some, but suppose it includes a major one. Then immediately there will be a very big difference between what you planned and what you, ended up with. And how can you make a fiscal management strategy consistent on this volatile item? You might as well be, in fact, dividends are far more stable in that sense than the disinvestment receipts. The third aspect is also to really see that you cannot actually think in terms of listed companies purely from the government point of view. What suits me? It's not that. I think what suits to all the shareholders, including minority shareholders. Otherwise, the very objective that we listed them in order to deepen stock market, in order to widen, distribution, allow stocks to come in from a variety of sectors, government stocks to be made available to public. These objectives will be fruitless because they have come in to make returns and we are not even, talking about their interest. So that approach also, in a fiscal approach, single line approach, you don't care about it. In a public asset management approach, it matters to you which company, how much, when you do disinvest. Because you have to keep in mind the company to company dynamics in the stock market into view. So that broadly, shareholders' returns are optimized. So these considerations actually, if you think that while every receipt is important, but predominance of disinvestment receipt as a panacea for public fiscal management is actually also not warranted.
A quick follow-up, rather two questions. Was the turning point 3 years ago when the disinvestment policy was formally enunciated by the FM in a budget speech? And secondly, that is it that this disinvestment policy that was announced stays?
Now, the disinvestment policy stays. That is a policy to disinvest. What we are talking is how you view disinvestment. At certain point when we say that we had privatization, which was talked about for the first time, we also could do some privatization. Not more importantly, not to actually get resources, but more like, get to realize the economic potential of the enterprises which were in bad condition. In both the cases, in case of Air India and Nilachal, it was like an opportunity cost and opportunity employment and economic opportunity, potential economic opportunity. Those were the cases. In terms of resources, they were not a big thing because they were in deep trouble. But there could be potentially if suppose you privatize a more healthier organization, then there will be resources which will accrue also. But those were, intending more as a reform, which means that where, government may actually shrink, remain in business for less number of enterprises than hitherto. So which means that basically lying to share it, but it has to be as per the policy itself, it has to be done over a period of time. One, it cannot be, it is contingent on context. It is contingent on each and every enterprise, number one. And number three are the bidders for it. Because we have actually done several of these things where we had repeatedly asked for bids, but we have not been successful to get competitive bids. Sometimes there's only single bid. Sometimes, that bid is not good enough. So just because you also want to privatize doesn't mean it gets privatized, because there must be takers for it. We are doing it in a public auction process. It's not a fire sale. It follows through a very intricate process where we call the people initially, call for their expression of interest, take them through to a due diligence phase on the company, call for financial bid, they could, finalize a share purchase agreement, and then ask for financial bids, which must be in excess of or at least match some of the reserve price, benchmark price that we arrive at. So after this process, also there is a processes to regulatory approvals, other approvals, state government's approvals in some cases where lands are involved. So you have to actually, that is also this contingent upon like any M&A transaction on several, ifs and buts as well. But if you finally do it, you actually permanently get out of it in terms of, management responsibility. That's a deep reform. Now, in order for that deep reform to happen, you need contractually, There are so many these steps, each one to be put into this and go through that process. That I think ongoing we are doing. But overall, when we do that, even that is quite uncertain. How much you will conclude, how much will not get concluded. And if you start, in many cases, they could be very small organization also. Like if you put them, then because if your equity value is only 200, 300, 400 crore, you will get as much. So your expectation should also be tempered, in terms of total resources that you put garner. So we should first say that how much of the disinvestment actually, if you do a bottom up, you will actually find that a moderate thing in a more calibrated manner, keeping in view the interest of policyholders and keeping in view these other imperatives like dividend, capex, etc., is a much better strategy on a sustained basis to grow. Which means again that our expectation on fiscal side to management for these items should be realistic and pragmatic.
So effectively, you're moving to commercial principles in both theory and practice. So my question is that does this now, or rather, is it getting picked up by state public sector enterprises?
I think to some extent, yes. For example, I think Gujarat recently, looked at and they have also now a consistent dividend policy. They had an interaction with us, they understood, and they have also implemented and started implementing. Madhya Pradesh, earlier they had an asset monetization department, a new department like us was created. They have in fact done far more monetization also. But this, single line thing, like if you say that you are only for disinvestment or monetize, that doesn't work actually. So disinvestment has to be in the context. If you don't have much value, you will only derive that much value in disinvestment.
Immediately after independence, India needed a vehicle to drive development, to recover from the 200 years of colonial misrule and damage to the Indian economy. The public sector emerged as this vehicle. They were called the commanding heights of the Indian economy with a reason. They were bringing development at a scale that the country had never experienced before. They did much more. They even raised townships like Bhilai to generate development in this country. However, by the 1980s, the public sector had morphed into the metaphor for sloth. They had begun to bleed the exchequer and were considered white elephants. The romance with PSUs is over. In fact, finance ministers started cutting back on budgets for public sector undertakings. Then, in the 1991 crisis, the public sector equity became a cheap means of raising desperately needed borrowings. For 3 decades, this continued till this budget. Now, what has happened in this period, the last 5 years in particular, the government has refocused and repurposed the PSUs into commercial undertakings with commercial metrics. This is being rewarded by the stock markets. At the same time, it created extremely lean and pretty mean enterprises, which in a crisis that happened after COVID became a very good utility tool to pass through much needed capital investment into the Indian economy. So all said and done, the PSUs now have come a full circle. They have regained the commanding heights of the Indian economy. Now that is food for thought, right? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.